But first, most of us have been drowning in news about coronavirus for all of 2020. Occasionally China makes headlines, and when it does, it's only over bans of Australian export products. For far too many Australians, we continue to frame this relationship with China as a juggling act between our economic interests on one hand and our alliance commitments with the United States on the other. John Howard expressed it very well in a much more benign era that Australia does not need to choose between our history or our geography. But that choice has been extinguished by China's increasingly aggressive behaviour. Many in the local China lobby blame Australia for the current crisis in our relations, but that ignores the growing pushback from the EU and many ASEAN states against China's quite naked ambitions. Today, we learned that Australian wheat is the latest industry to be buffeted, with imports to China down to near decade lows amid ongoing trade tensions. To discuss this and Australia's broader national security interest, I'm joined by a man who has served Australia with courage and distinction on the battlefield and is now a Senator for New South Wales, Jim Molan, a very familiar contributor on Sky News. Well, Jim, you've used some quite ominous language about a likelihood of a war between the United States and China because of China's increasingly aggressive behaviour both in the South China Sea and towards Taiwan. Do you want to expand a little on what you've had to say on the record today?
Catherine, good evening. Yes, I've spoken about this for some reason, and maybe it's associated with the grey zone conflict that we're in at the moment. But there's been a lot of attention to it in this kind of between Christmas and New Year.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because there's nothing else to talk about, but I reckon there's a lot to talk about. Yeah. What I've said is that war between the United States and China is not just possible, it's more likely than most people are prepared to estimate. And by not talking about it, by not admitting the possibility of it, we increase the risk of it occurring. Now, I've never maintained that war is inevitable between the United States and China. And if we add in the idea of alliances into that, see, I cannot imagine a war where China attacks Australia. But what I can imagine, and there's 1,000 reasons for it, what I can imagine is a war between the United States and China, which we in Australia can't deter. What we've got to be able to do is deter collateral attacks on this nation out of a war between those two nations.
And indeed, Jim, we've discussed this over the course of the year, haven't we? That I think a lot of Australians would probably be surprised. I see many in the strategic community, even Paul Dibb and Hugh White, saying, that there's still a choice were Taiwan to be invaded. But my assessment would be that it is impossible for the PLA to leave Australia unimpeded on the table while we host that enormous and seamlessly integrated US ground station network through our outback and some other facilities which we won't go into in detail. But we're integrated into the US space warfighting system, are we not? And so any operation against Taiwan would involve at least blinding Australia, and that would entail, if not kinetic force, some kind of electromagnetic attack on us, surely.
And we're getting the kind of cyber attack that you're implying every day of the week.
Yeah.
And I think that we are probably maintaining a defence against that relatively well, and the government's put an awful lot of money into exactly that. But I think that there are any ways that such a war might start. Taiwan is the flavour of the month, really. A lot of people are talking about that. But Taiwan, in my view, a Chinese attack to recover Taiwan as its own province is something that you can't just put in a square and say, well, this is between China and Taiwan.
Absolutely.
This has global implications.
Yeah.
If, for example, the Chinese decide to act on Taiwan and America doesn't act, then no one in Southeast Asia is going to take America seriously ever again. 25 million people who stand standing in contradistinction between an authoritarian China and a democratic Chinese society, fabulously wealthy and successful, that we've let go back. It was bad enough with Hong Kong. And the question then becomes, if America has to act, what does Australia do?
Absolutely.
And I'm sure there are contingency plans somewhere in the organisation for these. I think the challenge is much, much bigger. If, of course, Taiwan is going to be aggressively attacked by the Chinese, then they've somehow got to handle the nuclear submarines, American nuclear subs, which sit in the area. They've somehow got to manage crossing 100 kilometres of strait by sea or by air. They've got to somehow manage the American facilities on Guam and in Japan and maybe even in Darwin. This is why I say you can't just look at Taiwan as a separate and neat construct, which something happens there and it doesn't happen everywhere.
Precisely.
This will happen all over the world. What would Iran say if America was tied down in the South China Sea? What would the Russians do in the Baltic if America was tied down in the South China Sea? And God knows what North Korea would do.
And of course, you've got the situation where the Chinese do have vulnerabilities, don't they? In that they still are more reliant on Middle Eastern oil than they would like to be. And the United States Fifth Fleet has the capacity to choke them through the Straits of Hormuz and those traffic points at least. But they've reserved the right, for example, to attack US carrier groups on the northern side of Hokkaido. So as you say, any move on Taiwan would involve preliminary operations against other democratic states.
I think it's got to, at least if sea is going to be used in the invasion of Taiwan, then there are sea mines to be cleared. And 1,000 other things that they've got to do before they do it. But I think we could overstate the dependence on Middle East oil, because now with pipelines from Russia, pipeline from the stands, and the reserves that I can only assume China would build up before doing anything, that may not be an initial problem. But I guess what you're implying is that there's maybe a role for us in blocking the straits through the Indonesian archipelago.
Absolutely.
Of course, then we're into a bigger war.
Absolutely.
This is why I always say you can't just say that something between China and Taiwan is a nice, neat little package, that they'll do it or they won't do it. We've got a choice to engage or not engage. The Americans will engage or not engage. This has got potential to be enormous.
Merci d'avoir regardé la vidéo. Si vous l'avez aimé, mettez un pouce. Et si vous voulez faire partie de la famille cosmique, abonnez-vous. Merci, à bientôt. Bisous.